tänään kutse eest. Tänään me räägime tärkeästä teema avaliku halduse reform. Yeah? Kind of. Okay. So I think there's no better time to be a designer, to be a public servant, to be a politician. But this design imperative that I think we're going to talk about today is not one of choice, but of necessity. I think the problems we're facing are tremendous. I think we're underestimating the sizes of the challenges we're doing. And why it's so great is because these big impossible challenges we have can help us find a completely and better new world. I think our bureaucracies have reached their natural development peak, meaning that over time they've become quite good at certain things. And I don't think there's any efficiency measure anymore that is really going to fundamentally correct this ship. So while in the public sector we talk a lot about efficiencies, yes, that will get you a little bit further, but it's not going to fundamentally correct the direction of this ship. I think we need to redesign government and its delivery to meet our economic, resource, and social imperatives. And in this, I think government has a fairly impossible task, which is it needs to be slow and deliberate, meaning it needs to think about the next generation, and it needs to think about the generation after that, and it needs to think about sewer infrastructure. And at the same time, it needs to be nimble and quick. And actually, more and more, we're demanding that it does both things, both time clocks, better and better, while delivering everyday services. We can't shut schools down. We can't shut hospitals down, while at the same time, innovating those very services. So we're asking governments to drive fast and slow at the same time, and then to change the tire while they're driving. It's very complicated. So imagine for a moment with me a world without social inequality, without homelessness or violence, a world without receipts, a world without waiting, without queues, with seamless services, where the public sector standard of quality far exceeds the commercial standard of quality. A world in which Apple would look at envy at the public sector and lament if we could only meet a fraction of their quality standard. A world built around quality, impact, and social well-being that continuously exceeds the resource savings expectations of our new economic realities. A world where I could actually also speak Estonian. And I think this is actually all happening, except it's not happening in any single place, rather small, at times isolated, but fantastic little islands of innovation emerging around the world. So these realities which I just pointed out, for each one of them, there's a little pocket we can point to, but there is no place where it's actually all happening. So I thought I'd take a couple minutes, bear with me, and talk a little bit about, actually pick up what Jeff left, which is this question of visualization as one of the elements that I think design brings to the table. And for me, design at the end of the day is really about a process of building coherence. That's all it is. Right? When you have many things, many competing things, many dysfunctional things, how do you create synthesis that is coherent? But let's just talk about this aspect of visualization. So these are dates I like to throw around once in a while. Some of you have seen these dates. 2015, I think we can agree, is our year. 1850, 1550, 1202. So why these dates? Well, if you look at the prosperity we have today, and you ask where are the root principles where that emerged, I think you need to go somewhere around the Industrial Revolution. That's where the models of productions came out. That's where sort of this new model of wealth came out of. And then you can ask yourself, was this really a revolution that had happened overnight? Well, no, it didn't. There was actually a lot of seeding, of growing that happened before it that allowed for the right conditions to emerge. So I think you need to go to the scientific revolution to understand the Industrial Revolution. You need to understand that from one moment we began to realize there were scientific principles that governed our environment. By understanding them, we could shape and impact our environment. Right? So where did the scientific revolution come from? 1202, Fibonacci published a book that helped popularize a big transformation that was happening in Europe. And I would argue that that had a trickle-down effect to the things that we're doing today. And what was that transformation? It was quite simply the shift from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. So when I used to teach, this was the exercise I gave my students on day one, and you can give it a shot, and you'll be here for a couple of years. Do this division. Divide that number by that number. I guarantee no one can do that. And if you do it, you're lying, because what you're doing is you're translating Roman numerals back into Arabic system, which is our current system, and then figuring out what the number is, and then translate it back into Roman numerals, right? The answer is 54. It's not very complicated. So when we use this, we had a virtual impossible task at hand. We cannot manage mathematical complexity at all. We could barely add things, you know? I could barely handle doing the groceries, but that'd be about it, right? And then when we went to Arabic numerals, suddenly we had the opportunity, the tools, the representational tools to manage mathematical complexities. We could do fractions, we could do to the power of, we could begin to do all kinds of things that were very powerful and allowed us actually to understand the trajectory of planets. We could actually come up with mathematical formulas for that. And this was a mode of representation that allowed us to understand complexity. At this time, numeric complexity. And I would say we're in a phase now where we need to understand a new kind of complexity. And as Jeff mentioned, most policymakers, most politicians, most bureaucrats are faced with a very large table full of lots of reports, and they have to try to figure out what that all means as a synthetic whole. It's very hard to understand what all that paper actually means at the end of the day. So a great example of visualization is Menard's map of Napoleon's march to Russia, right? Why is this so great? Because it's so simple and intuitive. It is a map left to right. Paris is kind of on the left. Moscow is over up there, right? And it has a timeline to it. So it means Napoleon left, Paris on the left, with this many soldiers. And as he's going along, the soldiers are dying for various reasons, right? And some of those soldiers actually split off to fight battles elsewhere. And the black is when the French retreat. And in fact, you see a little bit of black coming back from one of these splinters, because as they went off to battle a side thing, they came back and joined up forces. And you can see at the left side of the map how many people went to Russia and how few people came back to Russia. I mean, that's staggering. And you can see it scaled in proportion to, right? Not just as an absolute number. And then you can tell that their rivers and geographic features would significantly impacted the course of battle. This band halves as the army has to cross geographic features. Then you have temperature down here. You have many aspects in here that all come together and create a very readable, intuitive map at a glance. Now, when I was at the Finnish Innovation Fund, I asked my team to do an Excel of this. And I guarantee you that the Excel spreadsheet to describe all the sets of information here is illegible and does not help create synthesis, understand the whole. I was at Harvard before coming to the Finnish Innovation Fund, and I had the pleasure of running a project that tried to look at how would you redesign healthcare delivery in the US, right? Not improve the model we have, but really think about what are the principles that deliver better outcomes at lower cost. And the condition we looked at was stroke, people who have a disruption of blood flow to the brain. And the science around that said that you had 3 hours to treatment. From the moment I have a blockage here to the moment I get treatment, I have 3 hours. If I get to the hospital later, it's all gone. And the policy around that was that the problem was not the system per se, right? The system was actually good. The problem was no one was going to the hospital in time. So it's our problem. We weren't calling hospitals fast enough. So all this policy effort was piled on here to ensure that people would call, hi Laura, people would call the hospital immediately, right? And that was the bottleneck. That was the perceived thing. And all this policy moved very, very quickly towards it. Well, we said, hey, hold on a second, okay? We're not quite sure that's actually the problem. Do we even know where the hospitals are and where people live? It's a very basic question. Are people even within half an hour of reach, right? It turns out nobody had a comprehensive list of hospitals that treated stroke patients because each state has its own policy and each state has its own directory of hospitals. So there goes problem number one. No one is looking at the problem across borders. Because guess what? When I get ill, I don't care that there's a political boundary there. I need to get to care as soon as possible. I think this problem probably exists in Europe. We probably haven't thought about health Europe-wide. We probably think of it England, Estonia, Finland-wide. And then we try to resolve little things on the border, but we don't really think about that. But you know, health doesn't have political boundaries. So anyhow, the first task we did was actually define what are hospitals that can treat stroke, because not all hospitals can, where are they located, and where do people live. And so the dark spots there are census data, more people in the dark spots, quite simple, right? And then we said, okay, let's see how many people are even theoretically within 3 hours of reach. So here you have to believe me, 3 hours means you have 30 minutes to get to the hospital, right? Because there's time it takes you to call, time for the ambulance to come pick you up. Then there's 30 minutes of travel. And then there's stuff that happens at the hospital before you get diagnosed and you get the green light for the therapy. And the therapy is basically an injection of liquid that dissolves the clot. So we said, okay, imagine in the US you drive 60 miles an hour, half an hour is 30 miles. And now we're going to go a kind of Euclidean simplification of this, and we're going to say everybody's a bird and we all fly in a straight line. So you'll see circles that emanate that don't capture time quite yet, but capture distance, which is a placeholder for time right now. So let's take a look at that. Right? And here you're seeing is plotting how much of the population is covered at any given distance, theoretically, and how much of the surface area of the country is covered. So this red, which is the 30-mile cutoff, which is our placeholder for half an hour, tells us that about 50% of the population, if they were birds and if they flew like birds and called a hospital immediately, you can get about half the population into hospital system. Right? So we know this is a kind of absolute theoretical glass ceiling to this thing. Now, Massachusetts, the state I was living in, is a very progressive state. And they realized many problems with this. One is 50% as your theoretical glass ceiling is not good enough. So what they did do, they said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have more hospitals. So they created a bit of policy to make every hospital in this state a stroke hospital. Now, that took a lot of political capital to do and a lot of financial capital to do. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars. You had to gear up hospitals that did not have neurologists there or certain services to become stroke hospitals. And now they had 72 hospitals, right, delivering stroke care. And when you do the same analysis, you see that 5-10 miles distance, radius away from any hospital, you're covering almost 100% of your population. So it looks like policy works on paper, right? The problem is while the population is covered well, the area of the country is not covered up well. There's two areas, if you've ever been there, Cape Cod, this funny-looking trumpet, and the Berkshires. These are the two most popular travel destination places in Massachusetts. So census data is great until you leave your home. Then it's worth nothing. So this raised the question, is what is the effect of mobile populations going to work daily or seasonally going to vacation on this problem? So we said, let's take boundary conditions. I think this is another thing design can do, is actually not explain everything, but extremes as a way to begin to frame the problem. So we said, what is a place we know that everybody goes to that has no hospitals? National parks. The red dots are national parks, and these are only the parks like Grand Canyon and Yosemite where I guarantee you there is no hospital, not even within 4 hours or 5 hours or 6 hours. So how much of the population? It's about 100 million people go there. As a static population, because some people go for 2 days, some go for 1 day, but as a constant population, it's the size of a city like Atlanta that's completely outside of our systems of care, that's constantly there. Okay? Now, that's semi-significant, but the interesting thing was that we found out by asking this new question that emerged by looking at a problem at a different scale, from going national to state, is that there is a yearly cycle to stroke, meaning that on average, we don't all get stroke equally around the year. We tend to get more strokes in the summer. And this is an interesting thing. So there's a significant peak when populations are most likely to be moving, going on vacation, going out of hospital systems, or going to Paris, where there are hospital systems, but I don't speak the language and I'm unfamiliar with the system. So putting yourself at risk. What's the impact of this on the system? All right, I'll end this little story about visualization with this map here. Now, this is one of those hospitals. This is Massachusetts, this is Boston. And I'm going to translate, finally. We're not going to be birds anymore. We're not going to be flying in straight lines. We're going to actually be sitting in cars and driving. So this is 30 minutes, actual 30 minutes. We worked with the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts to get actual traffic data. And this is going to shrink twice. So this is the Euclidean analysis we did, the circle. It will shrink the first time when it's actually 30 minutes. How far can you drive on a normal driving day in Boston? And then it's going to shrink the second time. And what is that second time? That is peak traffic. That's your morning commute. And why is that important? Because stroke has another pattern. It has a yearly pattern, and then it has a daily pattern. And the daily pattern means that you and I are most likely to have a stroke in the morning, in about 12 minutes or so, okay? And what's the reason for that? Is because as I sleep and I wake up, I change my posture. So anything that's kind of in my blood vessels here has a higher likelihood of finally going bonk into my brain. And because I need to come to Estonia and talk to you, my blood pressure rises. So the combination of change of position and blood pressure makes it the most likely moment for you and I to have a stroke. Well, you know that's the moment when you can drive the least in 30 minutes. But let's take a look. So this is actual 30 minutes of driving. And this is when you and I are most likely to need that stroke service. So you see that 30-minute boundary for stroke, when the population is most likely to have it, is actually quite small. When you do this analysis nationwide, that 50% theoretical becomes 10% theoretical. This means 100% of Americans call, and only 10% actually get to the hospital in time. On a drug that is 12% effective. So we are spending a lot of money on and putting a lot of political capital for a system that, when it's apparently perfect, will deliver 1.2% better outcomes. Out of a population of 100, a little bit over one person is going to do better. And guess what? The whole problem is the statistical approach to population. Strokes are very varied. Most strokes, like most cuts, are really minor. And what do we do with most minor cuts? We put Band-Aids on them. We can do that at home. A few cuts, like getting hit in the head with an axe, actually require a hospital. A few strokes actually require a hospital. And yet we're treating the most common stroke. We're building a system for the most common stroke, not the one that's driving our costs, our outcomes, our deaths, and mortalities and morbidities, right? And guess what? There is no 3-hour patient. We find out from physiology that you either have 5 minutes time or you have 12 hours time. But there is no 3 hours. So a lot of the problem here is very fundamental, very basic things that have to do with the way the mainstream logic that grew from science, that has proven itself in many fields, has actually permeated many of our decisions and our inability to actually see the flaws in them. The statistical approach to populations being one of them. But the fundamental problem here was no one was asking the right question. Everybody assumed that the status quo was the right solution, and the problem was just to make it more efficient. And my argument today will be that actually we need to redesign the status quo. And the point I wanted to make with this is that visualization is not to show, it's not a method of showing how great our ideas are. That is, my friends, illustration to me. I'll illustrate what's in my mind. But visualization, as designers use it, is a deep analytical tool to understand, define, and reimagine new realities. So I'm going to actually get to my lecture now. All right? So I told you I was going to talk a lot. So this is the debate today, right? I would say, this is how I want to frame it today. Then you can disagree with me, and I'd enjoy that. Is our imperative to change the public sector really a question about greater efficiencies or fundamental redesign? At least in Finland, all the debate is up here. You know, yeah, things are more or less okay. We need to cut, we need to squeeze, we need to make things faster, but no one's really talking about how do we fundamentally redesign what government is, and how it delivers. And I'll introduce my talk with this short video clip. It's from Jordanian TV. I think it demonstrates the challenge we have at hand. It is a kind of like hard talk program on BBC, if you're familiar, or A-Studio for those who are familiar with Finland. It is a political debate format live on TV.
ومراسل جريدة البعث والسانة والبناء اللبنانية ورئيس تحرير شبكة الأردن العربي.
طيب وتوب نيوز.
شايف كيف؟ وتوب نيوز. معلش لي الفخر في ذلك.
يلا بسرعة.
وكنت تنشر لي مقالاتي سابقا.
طيب مش مشكلة هلا
قبل أن تنحرف.
يلا تفضل تفضل.
عقد مؤتمر
حين يتم الحديث عن الانحراف فالمنحرف هو الذي يؤيد
أنت اللي وجهت.
المنحرف هو الذي يقايض المواقف.
أنت اللي بتقايض.
هو الذي يقايض المواقف بالمكاسب.
أنت اللي تقايض وأنت اللي هو اللي بدي
هو الذي
لو سمحت
هو الذي يتنطلق
أنت اللي
يتنطلق من حكم إلى حكم
بالبذاء
وفقا لمن يدفع أكثر.
لا أنت اللي بدأت.
أنا أخص.
لا يا انت اللي بدأت. يا شاكر انت اللي شاكر يا اخوان انت اللي بدأت. لا يا انت اللي بدأت يا سامي. لا
I love it that he had to go over and kick the guy. It wasn't enough to break the studio set. But I think this is in a way representative of the dilemma. We have very extreme opinions about things, and we have no way of actually creating new realities, new ways of actually bringing those conversations together. This is a highly ideological conversation they're having about a very sad thing, which is the war in Syria. But this same undertones I find are happening in Finland and Europe wide. They don't express themselves like this, but this kind of fighting is happening right now. Because there aren't any tools to really understand what that alternative is. And so we're dealing with extremes. A book I've been talking about recently for quite a while, which I've enjoyed a lot, is an Italian book called Il Gattopardo, and it tells the story of the unification of Italy. And you have to understand Italy is a fairly young state. We're talking about the 1800s when it was formed. And it tells the story of how in the north there was a vision about a new kind of state, which was a parliamentary-based way of leading. And Italy, up until then, was really a collection of city-states or small countries that were fundamentally feudal, meaning that there were princes that owned land and there were people who were slaves, pretty simply, all right? And so this new concept of Italy that came from the north, there was an idea about how to spread a campaign, how to create Italy. And so from the north, the northern men came, the guy with the glasses over there, to Sicily, and the idea was, let's talk to the Sicilians and get them on board. Get them to leave the old world and join us in this new idea of the new world. And then we'll have more people. And then we'll go to Calabria, and we'll do the same thing. And then we'll go up Italy, and by the time we're back in Turin, we will have unified the whole country. While it was a military campaign, it was actually more of a political campaign, right? And so when he comes to talk to the prince, he's talking to the prince here, and the prince speaks, I think, very eloquently about this dilemma, and he says this: "Mine is an unhappy generation, straddling two worlds and uneasy in both." What he's basically saying is he's a product of the past. He's the product of this feudal system. He understands the culture. He was born in it with a specific role. He speaks the language. He understands it. He's comfortable in that world. And at the same time, he realizes that world is no longer good. At the same time, he realizes there must be a better world, which is the world that this northern Italian is speaking about him, which makes sense and is where we should go. But to him, it's unfamiliar. He doesn't know what it's like. It's scary. Right? So he's caught between two worlds. The world that's comfortable, that he knows is no longer viable, and the world that he should be going into, that he's afraid of. And this is the dilemma in Finland and in Europe. We have inherited a past, and we're the sons and daughters of the past, and we're comfortable with all the flaws of the past, and we fear, while we intellectually recognize that we need to take this step into a completely new way of doing. And the question, I think, for the public sector is how do we tip it so that it's easier to get into the new world and leave the old world? So why is this so difficult? Well, I speak frequently about it, and I want to just highlight a few things. One is, very simply, we live in a different world. We've inherited institutions from the 18th, sometimes from the 17th century. Public sector institutions that were fantastically innovative when they were created because nobody knew, there was no model to be copied about how you ran a Ministry of Education. And so people had to create it. People had to try. I'm saying this because I don't want to create the illusion that the public sector has historically always been a boring, gray, uncreative place. Actually, it's been incredibly creative in many places and brought lots of benefits. And as we got good at that, those institutions became cemented. They became part of our daily life and harder and harder and harder to change. And we're at that apex of that trajectory, where they're not delivering the innovations we need, and they are completely cemented into our world. We have ministries that make no sense, and we don't have the ministries that would make sense. If I want to do climate change stuff around cities in Finland, I need to go Ministry of Energy to get one bit, Ministry of Transportation for another, Ministry of Housing for something else, Ministry of the Environment for something else. And guess what? They all have different cultures, different incentives. On paper, they seem to have the same pay grades. We have an A sort of system, like A21 and A22, which defines your pay grade. But guess what? Each ministry defines that differently. So an A21 in one ministry is a different pay grade than another. And if you want to, for example, hire somebody to work along two ministries, you can't get the lawyers to agree what the pay grade is. So these institutions are highly insular, independent, siloed. And any innovation that we need to face today is going to happen in spite of our institutions, not because of them, on large themes that are integrated. So that's one. We've inherited tools that are to some degree obsolete. The second thing is this. This is for Finland, and I think you need to do this for any country in a way. Look at the history and understand what are some of the trajectories in that history. But this is the GDP growth for Finland per capita indexed at 1900. So if you earned one monetary unit down there, today you earn about 14 times more, right? It's pretty astounding. This curve doesn't just exist in Finland and many other countries. And what we really did, if you want to pick around the 40s or 50s, is we all used to live in the woods, right? We had woods, we had some moose, and then we had some blueberries, and that was about it. And then 5 minutes later, we had schools and hospitals, cities, industry. That transformation was radical. It was amazing, and it happened overnight. And it happened because of a small elite that drove a vision for Finland top-down, right? Today we talk about top-down as a really bad thing. But I think we need to also recognize that top-down and elites have also, in certain circumstances, brought good. It's not an automatic bad. And a generation was created. A generation that understood a certain model and saw the benefits of it. And you know, in Finland, there was no need to talk about anything because stuff was just happening and stuff was just so great. What's the conversation to be had? What's the problem, right? So there was a generation that understood a model, absorbed the model, and then never talked about the model. And the never talking about it was, let's say, further aggravated by the tenuous relationship with the Soviet Union. So you've had a slightly different history, but a shared history. And for us, it meant that there was no room for political debate in Finland, right? Because political debate might equal political instability, which might equal the Soviet Union deciding that it's better for Finland to actually be sort of annexed, right? So in Finland, there was a generation that, from a positive side, never talked because good stuff was just happening. And then on a darker side, never talked because talking was a national security risk, right? So let me color this in pretty extreme terms. This was a bit of an alcoholic family. I mean, there was a problem. And the sons and daughters of alcoholics are likely to pass on those traits unless you break that cycle somehow. And I think we're still dealing with a generation of that generation that still has some of those cultural traits, some of those cultural beliefs. And that's why this change is so difficult. It's not a technical change. It's a deeply cultural project, right? And we believe that what worked so well in the past will continue to work in the future, right? Yeah, this economic thing, yeah, but then when we get back, right? And in fact, we have a lot of narratives. We have the narrative of our winter war with Russia, you know, where this tiny country did the impossible. And every time I'm in some meeting where, you know, the world is really not going in a good direction, somehow this narrative emerges. And I'm like, guys, really, let's not fool ourselves. But we create these narratives of the past to explain what good happened in the past, and we assume we can just translate those narratives there. Well, when the crisis gets bad enough, we'll be running in the woods and we'll stop this thing. All right. But the reality is that this economic trend is actually more like this. It's plateauing, it's even dipping south a little bit. And the big challenge is what I would call the cultural delta, meaning I'm born with the beliefs that even though I intellectually understand something, deep down, I really just know the culture that I was born in. That is, we will make it. The past will help us in the future. And the reality is something quite different. We need to find a way to quickly bridge this together. So that's problem number 2. The first is the inherited culture and institutions. The other is success breeds contempt, to put it very shortly. The third is our system, our very basic system. We have politicians and public servants, and they serve a role, a very specific role, that together create sort of our public governance structure. So politicians, in this case, George Bush, their responsibility is to tell us what the future should be like, give us visions. Let's go this way. And these, the Alan Greenspans of the world, they're experts, technicians. They tell us, okay, George, if you want to go over there, this is how you do it. Okay, we need some bubble gum, we need some tires, we need some juice, and then we can go over there. The problem is, less and less so, do politicians have the skills to understand what the problem is, to ask the right question, like in the healthcare example, or to have the tools to understand what the future could be like. They have tools to figure out how the future could be an extension of the past, but not how the future could be something that was not in our past. And likewise, technicians have a very hard time understanding with these new realities. And what we saw in the subprime crisis, which we've seen over and over, is that the politicians don't really grasp the complexity, the interconnected nature of these challenges. And past logics are actually hindering our ability to go forward rather than make them progress. And this idea that we can create visions first, then technically execute them, and then implement them, and then create change. This linear approach just doesn't work. Because A, we don't actually know what the problem is, and we won't know until we try something, so we need to start putting something together. And when we start trying something, we will have more political vision about what needs to happen. This process needs to be much more iterative, which challenges the roles and the firewalls that have been built here. We're not very good at being, let's say, forgiving to politicians who say, the future's over there, and then 5 minutes later saying, oh, no, sorry, it's over there, right? But what if you did something that made you realize what you didn't know, and you suddenly come to the realization that the future's over there? So we as a public also need to change our relationship with this dynamic and actually be okay with politicians saying, I don't know what the future is, but I know how we can take the first steps in figuring that out. That's a very different kind of political discourse than the discourse of promises and visions. And all of this has created a kind of, I would call it a mainstream, a dominant way of seeing, a dominant way of behaving. And the difficulty for us when we talk about design or innovating, with fundamentally changing things and delivering new and better solutions, is how do we get this giant car, this giant ship of dominant culture, of the mainstream, to actually shift in a different direction. Now, when we talk about design, I frequently use this overly simplistic sort of diagram to represent the idea that the quest, the impulse for design starts on a far left end, which is that at some level, somebody has recognized that there is a problem. And organizations or individuals will figure out, whether through good methods or not so good methods, how we begin to define what that problem is. And usually it's a process of narrowing down until we have a brief. We've identified what it is, we've given it boundary conditions, and then we usually hire designers at that point to create solutions. That's the traditional role of design, has been to respond to briefs. But as you've seen in the healthcare example, and I could give you examples over examples over examples, frequently and increasingly so, we're asking the wrong question. So this innovation imperative will be responded not just by answering to the given questions, but helping enlighten clients, helping enlighten politicians, decision makers, and making sure that we're asking the right questions, that we're having the right set of inputs at the far end. This is what I would call strategic design, helping shape decision making. This other end I would call service design. If we just do service design, we will have potentially fantastic services, but the danger is they could be the wrong services. No one's question, is this the service we really want? Will make dying more pleasant, so to speak. If we just do the strategic end, we might have the best new frameworks, but no new delivery, no new impact for citizens, right? Well, that's a great plan you have over there, Mr. Prime Minister, but I don't see anything around me changing. So these complement each other, asking the ability to help influence the right questions that can then define the right set of services to be delivered. Right? Now, I will rephrase that. I think the two arenas we need is design to tackle systemic challenges. This interconnected nature of problems that governments don't quite understand, that institutions aren't well aligned, and that professions, quite frankly, aren't very good at aligning themselves with. When I was at the fund, at the Finnish Innovation Fund, I had the honor of running a large-scale project, which was a development project in Helsinki, and we wanted to make that a catalyst for zero-carbon development in Finland. Now, that is not just an architecture problem. It is also an energy policy problem. It is also a planning problem. It's also a behavioral problem. I need not just make the building zero energy, but I also need to begin to think about what is the consumer and behavioral aspects that contribute to more or less consumption, more or less carbon, which has everything to do with food, with the services I use. The boundary of that problem becomes very complicated. The professions you need to integrate together becomes very complicated because you challenge with professional identities too. And there is no ministry or institution really that does this whole work. And what we ended up doing was to try to deliver a building, but the building was really a Trojan horse, a vehicle to try to change the system. Because to do zero carbon in Finland, in the building sector, you need to change fire regulations to allow new materials like wood to be used on a large scale, which have a fraction, if not a negative fraction, of the carbon footprint of concrete. But you need to do the regulatory stuff. You need to align services to be services that promote a zero carbon lifestyle, which means you're going to have new kinds of businesses on premise, which can, for example, guarantee rents for much shorter times. A lot of these are smaller ones. So the business model of getting on board guaranteed cash flow for 10 years is not going to be a kind of structure for this development project to work. You need to activate citizens to understand actually what are their needs and their behavioral aspects that impact this question. Who's doing this work? What are the professions that can do this kind of architecture of the solution? There really aren't there. I think designers are in a pretty good position to be able to do some of this kind of work. What institutions are doing this? None. When you go to the ministries, each one is doing one little bit, but no one is actually has an architecture of the solution to understand what bits need to be done, how, in coordination with what other bits. So you get tons of nice little pockets of innovation, each one pushing and pulling on a problem in a different direction. And at the end of the day, there is zero-sum solution, meaning that this great little policy bit was great for the carbon thing about materials, but it actually had a side effect, which was create a problem around consumption somewhere else. But that, guess what, was in another ministry, so we didn't really think about that. So bringing design at the level of understanding these systemic issues, helping policymakers frame the right questions, and understand what kinds of services should then be delivered out of this architecture. And at the other end, design needs to enter in a very strong manner in rethinking our public services. I think for most of us, many of us, one of the defining characters of public services is waiting in boring places, right? If that was a commercial proposition, there would be no people. We have a captive audience. And for us in Helsinki, as many of you know, one example was Jana over here, which was working in public services with families with children and on the web interface. And the web interface for public services in Helsinki or any city in Finland is really a web page that tells you how the organization is organized. And as a user, I could not care less. I don't care how many departments you have. I don't care what your billing fiscal code is. I actually just need somebody to help me with a crisis I'm having with my child. So we said this service should not be built as an extension of the logic of the organization, but as bringing in the logic of the user. It's quite simple. It should be much more like Google. Tell us what you need, and we'll figure out what the quickest path to that thing is, right? And so maybe not the prettiest thing in the world, but we did this. It's a phone number. There's a drop-down menu. You can figure out who's the public servant in your area right now and their phone number that can answer your call. And as we put this out quickly, in 2 weeks from a public procurement decision, we began to get feedback. And we iterated. This is how most stuff in the world works, right? In fact, many sort of internet-based companies will upgrade their service hundreds of times a day. Governments usually procure once. They put that giant website out for 10 years, and then they update it, right? But this iterative process allows you to see where people are going, where's the traffic happening, where are the roadblocks, what would people prefer? But this process, like the political cycle between politicians and technocrats, that virtuous circle, that going back and forth, this back and forth between implementing and redesigning, challenges everything. It challenges public procurement. Because the third time you do this, you're going to exceed your 30,000 European limit for public procurement. Then you need to put a stop on this. You need to hire lawyers, go to a public bid. It's going to take you 6 months. You're going to lose all the momentum and all the credibility. Or you could do the smallest thing at the beginning and procure it for 10 million euros in case it becomes the next great hit. Right? There is no real viable path here. So I'm just saying the mainstream way of doing is really quite powerful in making sure that these new modes of working have a very hard time coming in. So for our conversation today, I want to suggest 3 very simple design principles. These are very high level, very abstract, but I think quite concrete at the end of the day. One is this conversation about government needs to shift. I'm tired about talking about small government. I think we need to talk about smarter government. I don't think the size of government is important. But now when we're in an economic crisis, everyone is saying, let's cut, cut, cut. That's the first thing you do, is you cut. And then we'll figure out what we have. As if tomorrow will be an extension of yesterday, but just a smaller version of it. Do we really think that's going to be better? So first, we need to think about smart, doing things better. And my argument for you is when you do things better, it's cheaper. But you don't start by making things cheaper, because then you just have cheaper stuff. I don't like cheaper stuff. So anyhow, the second thing is stop improving the past. Let's design the future. We're going to need new kinds of solutions, right? And the third thing is let's stop talking about innovation. Let's actually resource it. When you go to governments, you go to municipalities, innovate, service, design, yeah. Where's your budget? Over here. Where's money for this? Oh, we don't have that. But we want to encourage everybody to do this. Okay, but if you don't resource it, which is mean you don't put people who have professional skills, you don't actually put money, it's not going to happen. It's nice rhetoric. All right, so I'm going to give you a few ideas. I'm going to run quickly. Sorry, I told you I could talk. About a few ways to try to change this dominant culture. One is embrace impossible challenges. Right? In Finland, we have a lot of impossible challenges. One of them is what we call sote, sosiaali ja terveys, which means social and health, which means, well, nothing's happening really. We need to reform that, and nobody actually knows how to reform it, and everyone knows how to disagree about what we should be doing. These kinds of challenges, like reforming social services and healthcare, seem impossible in Finland. And it's a burden, and the tone of the conversation is a burden. Oh my God, right? No, let's embrace these. These are fantastic, because when things are impossible, the only way to solve them is to rethink everything, right? You have to give up everything. And the story behind this, the text, is a story of Constitución in Chile in 2010. A small, about 80,000 people city that was destroyed by the 2010 tsunami. City was obliterated. They had a very simple question: how we're going to replan. And the normal planning process in Finland, which is pretty much the standard in Europe, is for new large parts of town. The planning process is 10 to 15 years. Let's just pause for a moment. Think about that. 10 to 15 years for a bunch of guys to agree where the lines on a piece of paper are going to be. Okay? And after that, we can start digging, and after that, we can start building buildings, and then 25 years later, we'll have houses, right? So they realized that this trajectory was not possible. And so they self-imposed an impossible task as a way to force them out of the dominant way of working. They said, we're going to do this in 3 months. What takes 15 years, we're going to do it in 3 months. So everybody coming into the room knew that, well, the normal process is not viable. If they had said, we're going to do what usually takes 15 years, we're going to do it in 8 years, the conversation would be completely different. Everybody would say, oh, we could squeeze the given process to fit this. But everybody had to let go. And what they basically did is they took a very linear approach, and they did everything concurrently at the same time, right? The design process was happening in City Square, open to the public, and the public could come and get feedback as design decisions were being pondered. Not after they were made, but as they were being made. This, I would say, is passive co-creation. But then they took a very active co-creative role, which is to put public servants in people's homes, to go and talk to every citizen and understand their realities. Not that they're making design decisions, but they understand the context and the realities better, right? They did the planning, the design work, the technical work, the political work of deciding, the engagement, and fundamentally the decision-making process, all one at the same time. 90 days later, they had a master plan on the table, the citizens voted, and 97% of the citizens of Constitucion voted for the master plan. So I use this example a lot, but as an example, when you do something impossible, if you get it right, not only will it be cheaper and faster, guaranteed this was cheaper and faster, but it fundamentally, more importantly, far more better. But this was not an extension of the past, and it was not about efficiency. It was about fundamentally redesigning, all right? This is what happens in Finland when we plan. The city says you're going to have a highway, and the citizen says, no, we're not going to have a highway. And these things go to court. We have 1,200 master plans in Finland every year. About 9% of them go to court. Of these cases, 75% are brought by citizens, okay? If a case goes to court, it's an automatic 2-year delay. Any delay is going to scare any private money away. What private money hates the most is instability. They want to make sure that there's a stable environment where there will be guaranteed returns on investment. So when you do things the way we do them today, it's really expensive. It's not really slow. It's really expensive. And we're spending a lot of tax money that we don't have on court cases to fight the citizens that we're supposed to serve. This makes no sense. And then if we win, we'll make them really angry. So the next reform we do, I guarantee, I don't care what it's about, there's going to be even greater opposition. And this process just helps create more and more unstable social environments. So the question of design, of creating processes that create more coherent wholes, is one of actually creating better investment logics, managing risks. It's not just about good services. It's a much broader kind of agenda. And we did this in Lahti with Sara, where we brought City Hall to the citizens on a new master plan project, and suddenly the dynamic changed completely. We did not have public hearings anymore, where citizens come to City Hall to listen to City Hall's discourse. We brought ideas to people where they are. Very important, changing this dynamic. Second thing is proposition-based. More and more of the challenges you and I are going to be dealing with are challenges where actually there's no solution anywhere, right? So while copying is good on many things, there are going to be more and more things that there's nothing to be copied. How do you do that? You can't be analysis-based, which is the way that governments have tended to work. You can't get all the facts because guess what? There are no facts. And maybe there are some facts, but the facts will keep changing for as long as you keep working on this thing. So I think a more important way is to think about working also in a proposition-based way, which is more closer to the way designers work. Meaning, I have some analysis, but I'm going to suggest, what if we did this? And the moment you put a what if into a context, it changes the context and you get insights. And by doing this iteratively, you can begin to actually develop solutions that work. It's a different way of trying to manage all the uncertainties beforehand through data collection and then hope that it will work. The third thing is actually by being counterintuitive. So if the mainstream thinks a certain way, creates certain kinds of logics, let's just be counterintuitive. So any meeting you go, if there's a dominant idea of how things should be done, try to invert that. See what happens, okay? So one thing in Finland, we like to think about dropouts as lead users. Dropouts in school, for example, aren't people who don't fit the system. No, the system didn't fit them. We need to think it the other way around. Maybe they have, people who drop out of school, a completely different learning need. And if we built an education system around their principles, we would solve their problem, but also help create a better and more robust system for everybody else. Over and over and over and over, there are examples, I won't get into them, where we can see that by taking an extreme population, it helps you to force to rethink a much better solution for the larger population. In the US, the state of Utah had homelessness problem. And they realized it was better to give free housing. Now imagine, this is America. Imagine being a politician and arguing for free housing for people. Well, because when people didn't have houses and they were in the street, it cost the state over $16,000 through emergency care services and other things. And when they gave them a house, it cost them only $11,000 because they used hospital services less, because they had an address, which meant they could apply for social services, which they could apply for jobs, and many other things. This is counterintuitive in the US, but it makes investment and financial sense to give free housing. And this year, they're on track to completely eradicating homelessness, which is a problem that one always associates with the US as a kind of inevitable consequence of a highly capitalistic system. The last one I would say here is the best healthcare is no healthcare. Think about this, right? The healthier we are, the less services we need, right? And yet a lot of business interest is to sell us more healthcare services. So if there's a business interest to sell more services, deep, deep down, there must be an interest in maintaining some level of sickness. The same with energy providers. While we talk about we need to save energy, energy companies want to sell you more energy. There are many misalignments on some of these major themes. And so when you begin to realize that the best healthcare is actually no healthcare, it can flip quite radically how you think about healthcare delivery, not making the services more pleasant and more abundant, but there may be some root cause questions that you need to also address to reduce the amount of health overall. And the fourth thing is this concept of citizens first. While governments have been built around these principles, they don't necessarily behave along these principles. And so this was something that happened in Helsinki several years ago. Many of you may be familiar. The camionette was serving crepes, and it embarrassed the city because the city could not figure out whether this was a car or a restaurant. And because it didn't fit their boxes, it must be illegal. Right? So this is the problem with governments, is we structure a world, and we assume the world is going to adapt to our logic. And guess what? The world is adopting other logics, and we need to start to figure out, actually, how do we create boundaries that make the external logic fit within our mission? So what happened out of this illegal effort? An even greater illegal effort, which for many of you is familiar. It's called Ravintolapäivä, Restaurant Day in Helsinki. It is a day in the year when a whole bunch of people agree they're going to open a restaurant in their home. Now, you can't open restaurants without sanitary licenses and a whole bunch of paperwork. But what you do when you're the city, and 600, or last year 1,200 restaurants open up on the same day. You can't arrest everybody. You can't arrest Facebook, which is the platform this was built on, right? It was really just a mode of coordinating illegal activity to such a high level on a single day where it would just defy the system. So here we're beginning to see where this system, you got to be a car, you got to be a restaurant, it's nonsensical, because there are new logics that are emerging that completely defy the logics of how the world is structured. Now, I won't get into this much, but there are these pockets of stuff that are happening out there, right? I'm privileged to sit on the board of Toimiva Kaupunki, Design-Driven Cities. Laura's here. Nesta is doing some fantastic work. There's many others. I want to highlight just a few things. One is outside of government, Community Solutions in the US is on track to try to eradicate homelessness in the US. It's taking an impossible extreme problem. It's changing the context of the debate by flipping it into an economic question, for example. And it's having great success. It's taking on a problem that traditionally is owned by governments and finding an outside way of solving it. There's an inside-outside model, which is Creo Antofagasta in Chile. It's a big mining town, and the town has really grown up as a shanty town for the mining industry. And the mining industry is realizing that if it doesn't deal with the social issues in the town, it'll create social instability, which will then put their business at risk. So they've created a fund, a certain percentage of their profits, to help create urban innovations. So it's commercial interest, having the smarts to realize that an equitable, well-being society makes business sense. It's a way to manage risks. And they're partnering up with non-governmental and governmental agencies to create this fund and manage this fund. It's government coming together with other entities to create new models of delivering good society. And then because you're talking about digital services, many of you know in the UK, government digital services, I think is an interesting model of how you can create change from within the dominant structure of government. So it's fundamentally a small team that now has grown quite big by design standards. It's over 200 people. It's got a pretty short tenure, but it's proven itself that it can engage the dominant culture on the dominant culture's terms. First year of real operations, £500 million of direct savings. But interesting is also the fact that they have certain bits in place to ensure that this is not just an interesting experiment, but that it fundamentally can change government. They have veto power, for example, on senior hirings in any government department. Right? This makes sense. Because as if you're trying to change a way of doing in one corner of the world, and the rest of the world decides it's going to hire people on completely different logics and do stuff completely logically, this stuff is just going to stay there. But if you can impact the kinds of leadership that is coming in other departments, it allows you to take the good stuff that's happening here and start spreading it like jam. It's very sweet. All right, so I know I'm running a little bit late, but give me 3 more minutes, or maybe 4. So I have 2 lists for you. One is a broad list for government, and then one is for design teams, okay? So 6 priorities for government. There has to be a very clear mandate that government needs to innovate itself. Any innovation conversation in government, when you listen 2 minutes, is about what is government's role in helping business innovate. Those conversations are rarely about how does government innovate itself. The mandate government has right now is to administer. Meaning public servants feel entitled to make sure that they administer the current services well. I don't think they feel very entitled to say it is also our job to question and change and innovate these services. Okay? So it has to come a political, clear mandate that if ever more than before, we need to also start innovating. That's part of our job, which means we're going to put time aside and so on to do this. Which brings me to point 2. Resource it, right? Any smart business puts 2 to 6% of their yearly budget towards research and development, fundamentally trying to figure out how things could be better. Dedicated money, right? So we need to do this. And imagine if you just had even a fraction of that in public services, what you could do with that. I've been in departments in Finland that run multi-billion euro budgets a year. And when you ask them how much of that resource is allocated to figuring out what needs to happen next, what are the new kinds of ways that need to happen, this department that I was working with had a budget of 50,000 euros. They're trying to use 50,000 euros to change the course of many billions of euros. It's just not going to happen. All right, the third thing, just to be provocative, we're talking about small government. We need to cut. Well, but let me be counterintuitive here. What do businesses do when they're struggling to be innovative? They merge and acquire. They do M&As, mergers and acquisitions, meaning they know that the smart stuff happens in startups and small companies, and they buy them. Why do they buy them? Well, because they get new markets, but more importantly, because they get new smartness into their organizations. So why couldn't government do the same? When there are teams doing fantastic work, NGOs and so on out there, let's bring this group that's doing healthcare or planning, and let's bring them into our planning department. And let's then make them part of us, and let's have them help us do more of that, right? May seem counterintuitive, but I think a strategy that we've seen that works fairly well in other contexts. I think we need to create career paths. In Finland, there's no mobility within government, and we can't even start talking about mobility between design communities and government, right? We need that. We need networks. We need people to create common language, common understanding, to be able to contextualize the work. And I think to build this, and I keep dropping at in my conversations the word design when I talk to public servants because I think it frequently gets in the way. I'm not talking about a profession. I'm not trying to advocate that we need more engineers or more designers necessarily, but we need new modes that can be borrowed from design. So innovation, where do we put it? Do we put it on the outside with all the freedoms like we saw Community Works? Do we put it inside, outside? So it has the levers of power of, say, the prime minister, but has the freedom to behave like a startup? Or do we put it in the middle? that it behaves like government, and it's the center of power. Well, I think that doesn't work. I think being on the outside makes you irrelevant. So I think the inside-outside model is the way to go. And I think the sixth point here for government is we need to redefine through co-creation a new social contract. We have basically a social contract, which is a promise between people. I will pay my taxes to you, and the promise of what you get in return. That is 100 years old. I'm just throwing a number out there, right? People live much longer. The world has changed. People live in different countries at different times. There's mobility. There's all kinds of things. That promise needs to be rethought. So what is the new role of government? What is the new promise? What is the new contract? All right, so for teams, and then I'm done. I really am. We need to build innovation capability, which doesn't mean that everybody has to be innovative or everybody has to be a designer. I think there has to be a small group that has the ability to do this. People in key positions who have an understanding. So when they're doing public procurement, they understand service design when they need service designers. And everybody should have an awareness. Doesn't need to understand what it is, but when you say the word design, oh, I've heard of that thing. All right. The second is you need to think about the governance model. As I said, I think inside-outside is a good way to go. I think this cross-cutting powers that GDS has, that I can veto decisions at key points elsewhere to make sure that things begin to align. And resourcing, I think, is important. I think you need to build innovation coalitions, which means understanding what already exists in the system, all the good stuff. Don't come in and build the super shiny new team and run over everybody else in the process, right? But understand how you can resource that. And then on the other end of the extreme, understand that as you ask people to change their belief systems, it's not a technical question, it's a deeply existential question. My sense of identity as a manager comes out of a worldview that is about highly structured ways of thinking. And when you tell me I need to think differently, you're fundamentally telling me that my self-identity is going to change too. This is a very challenging question. You're asking people to fundamentally become different. I think the skills and competences you would put in a team need to be hired because clearly there are competences that are missing in government. Real professional services to do co-creation, real professional people to understand the architectural problems and so on. But you also need to have half the team from inside that brings the capability and understanding of how the system works and has the legitimacy from the other people in different ministries to say, yes, that's one of ours. If it's all outside, it's going to get rejected like an organ transplant. And then the kinds of activities. Yes, we do services and we work on policy, but the space that we work in has to do with citizens and these systemic challenges. And maybe I won't get into this, but I think we need to think also about how teams like this or the work done by individuals like this then gets assessed. And at the end, I think is the most important thing is I hate metrics, I hate measuring stuff. I think it's important, but it's a real bore and it can really slow you down. I think the best metric of good organizations is the quality of their discourse. So conversations that have good quality of discourse internally, that's a very good measure of whether they're healthy and doing good work. All right, I'll end on these two things, which are very quick notes. The political challenge, you like how I sneak stuff in all the time. The political challenge for this is, and this is the belief in Finland and in Europe, we're in a crisis, everybody knows things have to change. Well, crisis is the mother of invention, meaning that when things get really bad, then everything will change. It will force us to change. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in this narrative. I'm afraid that as things get worse, things will get worse. All right? So this is from Greek Parliament, I think 2013, when Parliament had to pass a set of laws in order to meet the Troika's loan requirements.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, είμαστε τρεις άνθρωποι στην Επιτροπή. Έτσι θα γίνει η ψηφοφορία του κώδικα περί δικηγόρων.
Αυτή τη στιγμή έχουν κατατεθεί οι
απόψεις των
προσώπων και των εισηγητών. Λοιπόν, προχωρούμε στην ψηφοφορία.
Με τρεις
η ψηφοφορία ένα-ένα τα άρθρα για να είμαστε
There's something like 140 different things that need to be approved.
Εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 2. Εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία.
It's got a fantastic rhythm to it.
Εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 29. Εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 30. Εγκρίνεται κατά πλειοψηφία. Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 31 όπως τροποποιήθηκε από τον κύριο Υπουργό.
Όχι. Ποιος λέει ναι στο 31?
Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο
Ποιος λέει ναι,
32.
λέμε όχι στο 31. Ποιος λέει ναι?
Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 32 όπως...
Ποιος λέει ναι, κύριε Πρόεδρε? Πώς λέτε κατά πλειοψηφία?
Κατά πλειοψηφία.
Μα δεν είναι ψηφοφορία αυτή που κάνετε.
Εγκρίνεται το άρθρο 32.
All right, I'll end that. It gets wilder and wilder and wilder. And my point here is, do we really think that when crisis comes, will our institutions be more strategic in their thinking or less strategic in their thinking? And I'm afraid they become less and less strategic in their thinking. And in fact, in the home of democracy, we see that the thing that we hold most valuable, this value of democracy, is the first thing to go out when crisis happens. So that's my first sort of word of caution in terms of challenges for politicians. The other thing is we're already innovating. When you go to different ministries, oh, we're doing that. Oh, we got a project. We're doing this, that. There are these microscopic little flicks of stuff that actually prevent real stuff from happening because there's something to point to. I would love if there's a place that said, no, we're not doing it, because then suddenly there would be space to do. But the fact that people constantly say we're already doing that actually makes sure that nothing really happens. And the challenge for designers is that this mainstream that I've been kind of talking about it, you can think of it as a kind of solar system that has great suction, right? Yes, there are great pockets of innovation, as I started off with, but unfortunately, I think they're more like space dust, right? I'm not trying to be negative here. I was supposed to inspire you. They're fantastic things. So I think the challenge for you is, how do you do fantastic things, and how do those fantastic things change the trajectory of the mainstream? Right now, we're doing a lot of fantastic things that are not changing the trajectory of the mainstream. Thank you. Sorry. I owe you 6 minutes, 10 minutes.
Thank you. I really, really hope that you have some question for Marko.
I always ask for complaints too, but...
Kaspar.
Yes, you said you have 200 service designers in Gov.uk team.
Well, I don't work for government digital services. I'm an admirer of, Tom Loosmer and all the people who set that up. But in the UK Cabinet's office, there is a digital team, and there are over 200 now. So when you look at a lot of these kind of design-oriented teams, they tend to be, let me draw a bit of a caricature, one person who's there for 6 months, right? Which to me is a signal we're already doing that, so they can check the box off, but there isn't a real commitment to doing that. What I like about GDS is that they figure out a way to actually really root themselves into the system. And in time will tell how fundamentally they can change the system. But I think they've done some good work. Absolutely. Yeah.
In your experience, what are the best working, let's say, the models, how to bring this innovation to those old-fashioned government offices?
Well, I think that it requires many things. It's kind of like weather, right? The sun's not enough. We need clouds, we need moisture, we need a whole bunch of stuff, then we get weather. So in that weather, I think one of the more important things, almost more important than talent, is enlightened leaders. So, and I think for the talent in the room, part of the design challenge is to find those enlightened leaders in government. They are out there. They may not be aware, or they may not have been sensitized, or they may not have been tapped the right way. Because when you get an enlightened leader, they're able to actually make space for something to happen. So if you have great talent and no space, that's like a smoothie or something. I mean, it's tasty, but it's stuff just happens. But so that's, I think, one thing. The other thing, to kind of oversimplify this, I would say, is when you're trying to do change, and hopefully the purpose of all change is to do things better, right? The dominant way of doing this in governments is let's change organizations, and then let's hope that it delivers better. I mean, this whole way we do change, I think, is completely ridiculous. Let's move a whole bunch of people based on a diagram we have in a PowerPoint. We're going to create 6 new agencies instead of 3 new agencies. What a radically fantastic idea. And then we have a whole vision for this. Here's the text for it. And now we're going to move people and whatever, and then we're going to hope that actually it can deliver. So I would say the second important thing is when you get the right talent, is to give them the right space, the right conditions, to just start doing stuff. And doing stuff that's ambitious, of a really high caliber. Doing stuff that is mediocre while maybe a good leap forward, I don't think helps in the long run because it doesn't create enough of visibility from the everyday noise. So, and when you do that, and you engage the right people from the system, so you bring people from different departments and different teams to be part of your family, then they become spokespeople for your work. Then you have shared experiences with them. And if you manage this well, there will be more and more a call to do more of that great stuff. And slowly the organization will change around that good stuff. And it's much easier for people to then understand what it is that we're aspiring to and how do we do it, because people are beginning to have the experience of how to do it. So my simple way of thinking about this is you do first, and that goodness will change organizations rather than change organizations and hope for goodness.